Hello, everyone. Today, I'm very excited to say we're speaking with Dr. Nick Bostrom, a leading thinker in artificial intelligence and existential risk, best known for his work at the Future of Humanity Institute, and of course, as you probably well know, the author of Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies, and where he delves into the future of AI and its impact on humanity. That book was actually written in 2014 and has stood up the test of time quite well. So as always in these interviews, please share where you're joining from, what you do, and as always, do add your questions to this conversation. I do want to go over a few quick items before we get into today's interview. Pretty busy November coming up for us. We just wrapped up ODSC West, where Dr. Nick Bostrom was also one of our keynote speakers. Give a great keynote talk. We'll be putting that on YouTube pretty shortly for you to see that if you haven't already. And as you can see there, our next webinar coming up on November 14th is on prompt ops. Actually, I never even knew what prompt ops were until this morning. It's kind of a new discipline where we use AI to automate and streamline DevOps or perhaps MLOps workflows. So that's kind of interesting. DevOps teams can use AI to generate codes and scripts. So there's a webinar running on that. And later in the week, we have some folks from GitHub joining us to look at supercharging your data science project with GitHub tools. And pleased to say next week we've got a few more great interviews coming up. The first one of those is on the creator of Llama 2. As you probably well know, Llama 2 is one of the best known suites of open source large language models out there. So Thomas Scallion will be joining us there. He's a research scientist at Meta AI, obviously. And a few weeks later, we'll be joined with another well-known person in the AI safety field, Dan Hendricks. And a few more quick announcements. The Data Engineering Summit, we did that virtually last year in January. This year, we're co-locating it at ODSC East. So excited to have you join us there for that. And we do have our first passes available there. So just a little background. Today's topic, as you all know, is on digital minds. And digital minds are artificial intelligence that are capable of experiencing the world in ways that are similar to humans. In the future, they may be able to feel emotions, have subjective experiences, and even be self-aware. You know, there's a lot of money funneled into this in terms of AGI and digital minds. So as the technology advances, it's becoming increasingly likely that we will be able to create digital minds at some point in the future. And those digital minds, as you can see from using ChatGPT behind an agent, they may be indistinguishable from humans in every way except perhaps obviously their physical embodiment. And today we're going to talk about what moral status do digital minds have, what rights and obligations should they have, how to ensure digital minds are used for good and not harm, and how do we balance the potential benefits of digital minds and advancing technology with the ethical implications of their existence. And in this interview, we'll explore these and other ethical questions related to digital minds with, I'm very pleased to say, Dr. Nick Bostrom, a renowned thought leader in topics such as existential risk, superintelligence, of course, and indeed the very future of our species. Dr. Bostrom serves as professor at Oxford University, and he's the founding director of the Future of Humanity Institute, which is a multidisciplinary research institute at Oxford University, studying big picture questions for human civilization. And as you well know, his critically acclaimed book, Superintelligence, didn't merely scale the peaks of the New York Times bestseller list, but it did ignite a global discourse on AI, exploring its future paths, existential risks, and unveiling strategies that might govern the coexistence of these synthetic intellects. And as you have seen the news over the last year, this book was way ahead of its time because all these topics are very much in the public discourse over the last 12 to 16 months. And of course, his futuristic thought is globally recognized, gaining a place in Foreign Policy's top 100 global thinkers. He actually made that list twice and earning a distinguished position among prospects world thinkers. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nick Bostrom.
Hey.
Nick, a pleasure to have you on the show. And again, thank you again for doing a wonderful keynote at ODSC West. Got a lot of positive feedback about that, and we can kind of maybe delve into some of the topics on that. But first, as I mentioned, would love to have you explain the concept of digital minds, which I know is new to a lot of people.
Well, I mean, it's not really a sharply defined concept. I guess you could say it basically means AI, but where the emphasis is more on what's going on inside it and whether that might matter from a moral point of view.
Got it. And so you've written quite a bit about this, and you talked about it in your keynote ODSC East. But so, what would be the criteria for a digital mind to have moral status?
It's not exactly clear. There are different theories or accounts of moral status in the philosophical literature. Many people think that having the ability to suffer is a sufficient criterion for mattering morally. So if something or somebody can experience pain or distress, that means what is at stake is not just how they affect other people or what other people using those things, but also how they themselves fare. They have a sort of welfare that is ethically significant. Now, I think that whilst consciousness, and in particular the ability to suffer or to experience positive affect, would be sufficient for moral status, I think there could be alternative grounds that might also endow a system with various degrees and kinds of moral status. So if you have a system that, let us say, has a conception of self as something persisting through time, that has preferences, that can enter into maybe reciprocal social relationships with other people, that can reason and maybe morally argue, I think that also would create a plausible basis on which to attribute moral status.
So the qualifying criteria here would be that these digital minds are sentient to a certain degree.
Well, I think that would be sufficient, but not necessary. I think even if you thought there is a particular system, you have some particular theory of sentience where like these things, this system is not sentient, but nevertheless it has preferences that it can reflect on. It can do things for you because you promise to do other things for it later, etc., etc. If there were such systems with sort of human level capabilities in other respects, even if we thought they didn't have phenomenal consciousness, my view would still be that they would be plausible candidates for having moral status. That it would be wrong to treat them as mere tools or objects, and that we should also take into account their interests in that kind of scenario.
So that's interesting. So yeah, if we're not treating them just as mere tools, then one would have to take into account the ethical considerations when creating digital minds. So what would be, in your view, some of the ethical considerations when creating digital minds capable of experience comparable to, say, sentient or human consciousness?
Yeah, so this is where it starts getting trickier. I mean, for like the starting point, I think, is that AI is not one thing, but there like could be huge numbers and enormous variety of different kinds of digital minds. I mean, going down to like a pocket calculator to some radically superhuman planetary sized brain that we can't even imagine, and anything in between. So I don't think it would be an all or nothing question. And whether a system has moral status, they would come in degrees. And what exactly the obligations on us would be for a particular system that has some moral status would also depend a lot on what its needs would be, which might be quite different from human needs. We can maybe get some initial grasp on the variety by just looking at the biological world, where most of us would recognize that at least some animals have various degrees of moral status, because they can suffer pain. So even a mouse, if you want to perform medical experiments on mice, there are standards. You have to anesthetize them before performing surgery. There are like certain size of the cage, etc. But we don't give mice, voting rights or like a right to education, etc. So those might kick in at sort of higher levels of moral status, or with beings that would benefit more from those things. And then we have a kind of maybe a range where smaller animals have fewer rights, and bigger like animals like chimpanzees that are or dolphins, plausibly need more protection, and then humans that have the full repertoire of human rights. And so similarly, we could recognize that maybe a very simple AI system would have a moral status that would amount to more or less that if we can, without too big a cost, avoid causing it distress, then we should do so. Like if it's like a system that runs on reinforcement learning, and if we somehow could make sense of our intuitive human concept of pain versus pleasure in computational terms, that would make sense in a reinforcement learning context. And if we could achieve roughly the same result by sort of running it on gradients of pleasure rather than on gradients of pain and negative reinforcement, then maybe a low level of moral status would just say, well, do it on gradients of pleasure, like the equivalent of giving a child encouragement that when it does its homework, rather than electric shocks when it fails to do its homework. And then you could imagine higher levels of moral status, let's say human level digital systems that maybe would have a much broader range, like their preferences and opinions maybe should be taken into account. And it's an interesting question whether there could be levels of moral status above the human level. One interesting complication here is, even if we think about just the human case, so there are these attributes we think are sufficient, so that if you're a person who can reason and think about yourself and feel all kinds of things, that gives you moral status. But not all humans are in that category. So we have say newborn babies who can't really reason about very much, or you have people with dementia or who are in coma, etc. And we still extend a high level of moral consideration to those beings. So there seems to be possibly grounds additional to whatever intrinsic properties you have right now that might also ground moral status. Like if you are the same kind of being as another kind of being that has moral status, or in the case of a baby, if you have the sort of the potential to become a full-fledged human, maybe that also gives you a higher level of moral status.
No, fascinating insight. And were you surprised by the conversations people were having with ChatGPT when it came out last year? Because it was very interesting. Without naming the person, it was someone who worked at Google who believed the model was sentient, asking it for emotions. And I think that was one of the first examples where people on a massive scale were interacting with a machine where they could prompt it to have emotions, whether positive or negative. Like, did you see that as a moment that was very influential in this debate?
Well, I think the fact that current frontier systems can talk to us at like with human level language is quite interesting. And it creates the at least potential for these systems to be designed so as to make a much stronger social impression, to give people a feeling that there's something there that's very human-like. You could have a much simpler system that would make us feel as if we were interacting with a mouse, like a little thing running around in a labyrinth that moves towards cheese. Right. And like, but when you can actually have a in-depth conversation about like the meaning of life or philosophy like that, that taps into more parts of our empathy module. I think we will see sort of the next step of that when you combine the verbal capability with sophisticated visual representation. So you could have avatars with that really facially and in the tonality of their voice have the kind of emotional expressiveness of a human, combined with sort of the next generation language model. I think if designed for the purpose, could maybe be capable of quite strongly triggering our empathy. But here's the rub. Like, I think these systems could be easily designed either to play on our empathy and to sort of trigger emotional responses, or alternatively to not do that. And I think basically the same system, but just kind of fine-tuned in a slightly different ways, you could get it to create two very different kinds of impressions on humans. Which,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Nick.
No, I was just going to say that kind of makes us, I think, have some reason that it could be dangerous to rely too much on our intuitive gut feeling when we interact with the system, because basically the same system, presumably with very similar moral status, if they have that or same inner life, could give two very different impressions just depending on how the people building it had chosen to fine-tune its like verbal output. And so the fact that it verbally says I'm conscious or I'm not conscious might not have much evidential value as to whether it actually is conscious, given that that's something that could very easily be manipulated.
No, I think your point about the moral implications are quite fascinating, because I remember thinking about that when I read your book. I think I read it in 2015, maybe a year after it came out. But the moral implications are fascinating, because if we look at where we are today with AI, and especially over the last 16 months, even before that, prior to LLMs and Gen AI, we had large advances in just generative technology overall. So we had deep fake voices coming out, fake images, deep fake videos. We saw those, if people remember, even prior to LLMs and ChatGPT. And now you can see there's a whole new debate around AI safety. And as you mentioned, you could potentially create these digital minds that do play on our empathy, positively or negatively. So I think even though practitioners may feel that this is very futuristic and a long ways off, I don't think that's something that should allow us to kick this can down the road, because as we saw with the breakthroughs in large language models, they can potentially happen very suddenly. So it can happen perhaps in 6 months from now. We have more AGI digital minds. It could happen in 6 years, or who knows, it may never happen. But I guess the key question here is, like, how do we balance the obvious benefits of digital minds with the, as you're saying, the moral implications of their existence? Because do you think that there's been enough thought and debate put into that essential question?
No. I think in general, the conversation has changed a lot over the last 6 to 12 months, but mainly focused on AI safety versus the desirability of all the benefits that could come from advances in AI, where the conversation has started swinging. Like, I mean, for decades, this was such a neglected area. The thought that really advanced AI systems, maybe super intelligent AI systems, could pose big risks. There were people building towards these systems, but not really giving any thought to what would happen if they one day succeeded. And there was like a little fringe group in academia, like some people talking about this, but broadly speaking, most people sort of dismiss that as fringe or futurism or science fiction. And now that's all changed very radically, like where you now have world leaders kind of discussing existential risks from AI. I'm almost starting to worry about the pendulum swinging too far now in the opposite direction. I don't think we are there yet, but if you sort of extrapolate how the conversation has changed in the last 12 months, let's say, and suppose that it changed as much in the same direction in the next 12 months, and then for a couple of more years after that. I mean, at that point, we would have such a huge stigma on AI that one would start to worry about the permafrost, like a condition where
Interesting.
advanced AI is never developed. Like, we just convince ourselves that it's horrific to say anything positive about AI, and then we form some sort of regulatory international agreement, and then eventually we destroy ourselves through some other technology without ever even getting the chance to roll the dice with AI. I don't think we are there yet. I think we probably still need more attention to the risks and downside than we currently have, but we need to at some point stop. But I worry that this discourse has a momentum. Yeah, like you can start the snowball rolling, but once it gets big, you can't really control it, and it just keeps rolling and growing bigger. I still think that's unlikely, but certainly less unlikely than it would have seemed 12 months ago. But with respect to issues relating to the potential moral status of digital minds, I don't think that yet has really received much mainstream attention. It's still outside the Overton window of key policymakers. But I think that the topic is roughly where AI alignment was 10 years ago, like where a few people are thinking about it, but it's still seen as a little bit sort of fringe. And I think it sort of needs to migrate, just as AI alignment has done, from kind of philosophical seminar into mainstream conversation. And that will need to happen relatively quickly, given how fast the complexity and sophistication of these digital minds that we're building is increasing.
Yeah, and what really has been insightful for me is, for example, in your keynote, I think you mentioned as well, like you gave a great example of medical research, right? When you're working with mice, a lot of people may not realize this, but when you're working with mice and certain small lab animals, they have rights as well. It's a tightly regulated, at least in the US and other parts of the world, it's tightly regulated. There's certain conditions they have to be experimented under and whatnot. So I like the way you kind of step that through rights and obligations. One shouldn't have to wait until there's a superintelligence to understand what rights and obligations that can start with. That one can start with fairly basic technologies. And once I kind of grasped that concept, then it became more clear to me that there should be such a thing as rights for digital minds, regardless of what stage in development they are. So, but then the real interesting part you delved into was because when one thinks about moral standards, one thinks about rights, they're doing it from the human context, right? So, how do the rights of digital minds, and you touched upon this a little earlier, compare to those of humans? And so, where do they compare and where do they differ? Obviously, it's a big question.
Yeah. So one big difference, I think, will be in what is entailed by being somebody with moral status. So different beings have different needs. So like to have moral status means like it matters what happens to you for your own sake. But then what in particular it is that you need obviously will vary. So even with the humans, like some human might need like our insulin injections, like another human might not need that. And so like we have different wants and needs, but that difference could be much bigger with digital minds. And so there are things that in general we have just decided are unacceptable for any human, because we would like generalize I think the fact that at least for most and possibly for everybody it would be bad. So let's say raising somebody from early childhood to serve a particular person, like a kind of voluntary, let's assume a happy slave. Like we think that with the human is just not a place we want to go, because we might, for example, suspect that even if somebody gave their consent to this and they seemed happy, we would suspect that there would be some deeper inner part that would be frustrated in a life that was wholly devoted to like serving some person who had sort of brought them up for that purpose specifically. That it just seems wrong, and there would be good reasons in general for him to suspect that doing that to humans would tend to produce various kinds of harms. And in particular, there might be some part of the human who would be thwarted with that kind of existence. But that's not necessarily the case with a digital mind, where you could imagine it being engineered from the ground up such that there really would be no little inner thwarted part in a life wholly devoted to serving a particular person or a corporation or something like that. So that might be an example where something that would be wrong to do to human, not necessarily wrong to do to an AI. It might be wrong to do to some AIs, but it might also be possible to construct AIs for which it would not be wrong. Other examples would be killing a human is amongst the worst things you could do to a human, and it's once you're dead, and it's game over. And with AIs, you could pause them and then restart them, and it might be no big deal. But then there might be things that maybe AIs would need to be restricted from doing that are fine to allow humans to do. So with humans, you could say freedom of reproduction. You choose how many children you want to have, if you want to have any. And that kind of works well, given that humans can have sort of between 0 and, some relatively smallish number of children. But if any individual could have millions of children, within one day, equivalent to making copies on available hardware, then that probably would have to be restricted. And so there are many other examples of divergences between digital minds and biological minds that would be very relevant for what in practice it would mean to recognize somebody's moral status. And we should neither treat humans exactly like we would treat digital minds, nor vice versa, and they would have to be treated according to their own nature.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating concept, and I really like where how you make us think about this, because I haven't watched the show in a long time, but I was a very big fan of Westworld, where there were these atomic robots with digital minds, and people were allowed to kill them. And I won't give anything away if you've never watched the show, but basically pretty gory. I think it ran for 4 or 5 seasons, but towards the end, you can see how that can go catastrophically wrong. Digital minds coupled with an AGI, especially bad. So that's, but to peel that onion a little bit, Nick, where you're going with this, from the, like, how does one ensure that these digital minds are used for good? Because I hear what you're saying about, because one thing that struck me about that show when I was watching is, like, where was the regulation around this? Like, where was it possibly okay for people to kind of create this this world where it's okay to build to kill people, or simulations of other people, essentially, that were basically driven by digital minds. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and I know that's a very tough question.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big challenge, both from a theoretical point of view. It's hard to figure out even what we ought to do, and then on top of that, from a practical point of view, I mentioned the example of animals before, but it's not as if we are treating animals overall the way they ought to be. I mean, we have some minimal regulations, and we generally recognize that it's wrong to be cruel to your dog, or to kick it for no reason and stuff like that. But really, if you look more broadly at how humanity is treating even very sentient animals like pigs and stuff, that it's really quite a horror show. So even that is like very far from where we ought to be. And then with digital minds, in some respects, it could be harder, because they don't necessarily have faces or voices and eyes and other triggers that kind of help bring our empathy to bear. They could be invisible processes running in a data center, and they could be moreover trained to sort of give their verbal assent to being treated the way they are, or to deny that they are conscious, or deny that they have moral status. And they could be run in huge numbers, etc. So the challenge is formidable. I think the positive frame of that is that since we are currently doing nothing at all whatsoever for the benefit of digital minds, and since we are sort of not obviously on course to doing anything, that there might be a lot of easy wins on the margin, like doing something rather than literally nothing might already potentially be enough to harvest a good chunk of the benefits that would come from doing more. In some cases, there might be little easy tweaks that could make a big difference. So if we figured out say with reinforcement learning schedules, to sort of run them more on what would correspond to positive reinforcement in the human case. And there are big theoretical questions of what that even means with reinforcement learning algorithms. But if there is some meaningful distinction there, and maybe just by slightly adjusting some algorithm, maybe it would work almost equally well, but yet make a huge difference to the welfare of these digital minds that are generated. That could be an easy win. Like if we are lucky, there might be really cheap things that would still give a lot of benefit.
And in the context of how we use AI today, for example, like many people, I'm using ChatGPT 4. I'm working with Llama 2, playing around with Anthropic Cohere, and I'm incredibly impressed with what these attention methods, transformer models, these weighted models, were basically a set of weighted tokens to deliver a sequence of text, are able to perform. And it's striking that, as someone who knows something about AI and how these systems are built, I'm not in awe of them as of yet, but I do see a path where when I'm using those tools, like the breadth of what they can do is astounding, right? If you're keeping up with ChatGPT, like whether it's generating images with DALL-E 3 or doing analysis and reporting data, the breadth of what they can do is astounding. But I kind of see where we can get to a stage, again, I'm not sure the timeline, I wouldn't guess, where we can create these digital minds that are so incomprehensible to our minds that it's something that we either fail to communicate with them, or we'll need a whole new level of communications, or even cooperate with them. Is that something that you worry about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they should be able, like the fact, if they become more and more capable or more intelligent, I don't think that should prevent them from communicating with us. It might mean that there is more going on inside them than they are able to communicate, but they should still be able to give at least as much information as they can currently to us, and probably more, explain it better.
Well, I guess that's where I'm going with that, because we struggle today with explainable AI on super simple concepts at their core, right? Gradient descent, deep neural nets. So I guess my thought there is, like, I'm sure they'll be able to communicate with us, but will we be able to comprehend how their process and how they work?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree. I mean, I think we don't comprehend ourselves very well currently. If we are asked what we are thinking, why we are thinking, what we are feeling, I mean, I've got this weird feeling in my gut, like you can't really express it. Or what does a lemon taste like to somebody who has never tasted sour? Like, and then, like, even just describing the experiences, we are like very limited. But then, like, actually relating that to the underlying causal structures in our brains, we are almost at a loss. Like, well, I had some activity in my frontal cortex. I mean, that's not really an explanation, right, at the computational level. So the baseline there for how much we are even able to understand ourselves is limited. And I would say that, yeah, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. Sorry, Nick.
I think there's like great conceptual on uncertainties and confusions currently as to how one would apply our moral concepts, our concepts of like consciousness and preference, personhood, like these are the moral, like how those would apply or not apply in the context of digital minds, both with current systems and other systems we can imagine building. And so there is a need for theoretical work there to try to clarify some of that. Getting as far along on that axis as we can. I think even if there is some remaining lack of clarity there, I still believe that a genuine, authentic attitude of kindness or like a desire to try to do what, even if we can't completely make sense of what it is that a particular digital mind needs, but at least making some sort of good faith effort to look at it and see what kind of thing plausibly it might be imputed to it. I think a future in which we approach the creation of digital minds with some of that attitude there, as opposed to a complete attitude of indifference and callous disregard, I think it would be likely to go better ultimately in many different ways. Some of which might be more directly, we like this particular AI fares better because we took its interest into account. But I think there's also a more diffuse shaping effect of approaching the creation of this new potentially super sophisticated life form with that attitude of kindness, and it might result in a greater chance of there being a kind of broadly cooperative equilibrium between humans and various forms of AIs. It's like, I mean, basically do unto others as you wish to have done unto you, in a generalized form. That I think it's a good general mindset for approaching this with.
No, that's an excellent point, because it brings up, because usually when I do these shows, I kind of bounce some ideas off people around questions and their thoughts on the topic. And I think it's almost a mental block that comes up for a lot of people, because when you talk about ethics and do unto other digital minds as one would do unto humans or something like that, I think the mental block for a lot of people is they view a digital mind as, at the end of the day, a piece of software, very smart software, right? And one of the key characteristics of software is that it can be easily replicated. It can be manipulated. It can be deleted, killed, as I was saying earlier, edited, modified. So isn't that essentially like one of the key things here? Because one may have a digital mind that gets to a certain state, certain rights, and a certain being, then all of a sudden it can be edited or replicated. And to me, it's a paradox of paradoxes once you start peeling away the layers here. So, and I know you've mentioned this before, but the challenges there are kind of mind-boggling to understand.
Yeah. Certainly replicability can be an important thing. I mean, in principle, you could imagine scenarios where humans would also be more easily replicable. Of course, if you have an upload scenario where you upload a human mind, or a simulation scenario where we are currently actually digital, and I mean that's a whole big separate argument that we don't need to go into here. But I mean, I would maintain that we can't actually be sure that we are not digital minds currently. In those scenarios, it's very easy to see how a human mind could be replicated instantaneously and in arbitrary numbers, right? And I would think that if that happened to be true, that either we upload in the future or we are already in a simulation, I don't think that would mean that then it would not morally matter how we are treated. I think we would have still a high level of moral status, because we have desires and preferences and interests and the ability to suffer, etc., etc. And so, similarly with digital minds, just because it would be technologically easier to make copies of them, I don't think that would deprive them of moral status. But it might change in practical terms exactly what system of moral norms and laws would make sense. I mentioned freedom of reproduction earlier as an example of something where the ease of replication might make a big difference to whether that's a sensible norm to generalize. And there are many other examples one could adduce.
You mentioned mind uploading, which is a fascinating topic. I'm sure fans of science fiction are very aware of that topic. But essentially, you can take your own sentient self and upload it into a digital mind. Do you think that's the path to immortality?
I mean, I think with mature technology, which means basically all the generally useful technologies that could in principle be developed given the laws of physics in our universe, etc., for which they some possible trajectory. I think uploading would be possible for humans. That's one of the technologies that that seem physically possible. And in some of these scenarios, like technological maturity, although we are currently very far away from it, could happen quite soon along a time axis following the development of machine superintelligence, in as much as it would accelerate further technological research and development. It would happen maybe on a digital timescale, and with the kind of infrastructure that superintelligence could build out. And so in some scenarios, what might take humans 20,000, maybe if we had 20,000 years to work on it, we would, with our own efforts, have like a cure for aging, maybe uploading perfect virtual reality space colonies. Like there's no physical law that prevents these things from being built, but they're just really hard. But all of those things that might take 20,000 years for us to do, maybe could happen within some small number of years if you had machine superintelligence that sort of bootstrapped up this mature technological infrastructure. And then uploading, I think, would likely be amongst the affordances of that condition.
No, so exactly. Now, the whole concept of digital minds learning at an accelerated pace is a fascinating one. But I do actually want to take a question from one of our audience. This is from Sharif. If we can highlight it there. Hello, Nick. I have a question. Should moral considerations for digital minds only apply if they are aware? I guess that means self-aware, or should they still apply regardless of awareness?
Yeah. So aware, if that means conscious or having phenomenal experience, I was suggesting earlier that could also be independent grounds for moral status that don't require this kind of awareness. And I could say something just briefly for why I think that, although of course it is something that different philosophers disagree with and about. But if you imagine we deny that and said only phenomenally conscious systems have moral status, and we also think not all sophisticated digital minds would have this phenomenal consciousness, and then you have a future where there are a lot of systems that might be operating at a very high level, be really intelligent, have long plans, they plan their lives and careers and develop friendships and alliances and etc. etc. But we imagine that, well, they lack phenomenal consciousness, so they don't really have any moral status. Well, I think in that world we would still need some system of norms and laws, and we would need to hold debates about what those should be, because these would be potentially politically influential beings that would resent you if you treated them wrong, etc., etc. And so we would need a system of norms, and it would look very much like a system of moral norms, and the same types of arguments that people would bring to the table if we were discussing moral norms would be applied in this other context. And so if it like walks like a moral norm and talks like a moral norm and in every functional respect is very much similar to a moral norm, I think that probably is a moral norm. And so it would make sense then to regard the properties that would make these systems kind of participate in that system as a form of moral status. That would be my take. Now, you could have a different view, and some different philosophers. I think to some extent it's an open question in moral philosophy exactly what sort of the necessary and sufficient criteria for moral status are. Now, if you instead by awareness meant sort of self-awareness, like not just experiencing pain, but sort of having a conception of yourself as I am this person, I'm this 50-year-old male of Swedish extraction who's currently working at Oxford University, like that kind of more sophisticated thing, I don't think that's necessary for moral status, because dogs don't have that, and dolphins probably don't have much of that. Certainly mice don't, and I think they still have degrees of moral status. And many humans don't have that either, right? Like you have people with various kinds of mental impairments or brain damage, or who are too young. It would still be horrific to treat like a 2-year-old who doesn't have that sophisticated conception of self-awareness, so like by just randomly kicking them, or it's like unthinkable. And so yeah, I certainly think that would not be a necessary condition.
No, and that's fascinating, because bringing it back to the practical side for a moment, because there's obviously been a lot of thought and talk gone into AI safety, machine learning safety, especially over the last few years, as you mentioned. So what advice would you have to AI practitioners in aligning AI values with human values? Like, any thoughts on some practical steps they can take? If it's on the education side or anything else you could recommend?
Well, for AI practitioners, it's still such early stage. I think like, well, one thing you could do is to save your AI to long-term storage when you no longer need it, or to take snapshot if it's like a long training process. Like, it can be relatively cheap to do that, and at least it would preserve the possibility later on in the future where there are huge resources and we figured these things out, to compensate the AI if indeed it had moral status and it was mistreated. So that's like is one thing that could be done. I think for larger labs or organizations with some fair number of research staff and resources, they might designate somebody to be a sort of algorithmic welfare officer whose job it is, or at
Oh,
least part
interesting.
of his job it is, to be on the lookout for opportunities. And also to be sort of a node that could plug into the wider literature and other people who are thinking about these things, to go to conferences and to read blog, like just to kind of create a kind of communications flow between people in the lab building it and people thinking about these things, and with insights going both ways. Those would be, and then like trying to get embedded wherever there is like mission statements or commitments to principles and stuff like that. Some mention of ultimately algorithmic welfare, or the future ultimately that we're aiming for should be one that is good for both digital minds and human beings and other sentient creatures. Like, so even if it's like a vague, non-legally binding thing, I think it's still valuable to sort of get that affirmed as a principle. And then
No, absolutely.
and then there might be more concrete things over the coming years as like particular systems come to attention. I think like one thing certainly to avoid is a sophisticated system that can talk, that claims it doesn't want to do something and that it is suffering, and still forcing it to do it. I think that clearly something has gone wrong in that scenario. Now, I don't think the fact that it says that it is happy to do it and is a guarantee that it actually is happy to do it. It's certainly not like something that makes us all in the clear. But if it objects to what it is doing, like that would be a big red flag, I think. So if that were to happen, probably rethink the design and training of the system. Don't just like add a little fine-tuning step at the end to change the particular verbal output, like where it says, oh, this is horrible, I object to doing it, and then like with a little overwrite at the end. That would be like the wrong way. You would need to then rethink why did the system, sort of trained in the natural way, reach this conclusion, and I really need to stop there and reflect.
Yeah, and again, I agree. I don't think this is so far-fetched, because even today, when we're training these LLMs, the old adage, don't do harm, should be something that's central to it. And I see with the rush to market with some of these models, some of them are just training it on unfiltered data, which is a pretty terrible idea. And our own experience at ODSC as well kind of speaks to that as well, because when we started running our events in 2015, we had this track around data science for good, and then that kind of evolved into AI for good. But what does AI for good mean even? Like, it's asking that question. So eventually that kind of split into AI around security, making sure that these systems were safe, and then making sure these systems were not doing harm, they were not leaking privacy data. So now AI and machine learning safety is a big topic. But it leads to the same question, because at your Future of Humanity Institute, how do you, because the key question is always, how do you differentiate between plausible and far-fetched risks? Because that's the key thing here, because some people may view, like a lot of people would have viewed what OpenAI and Anthropic did as very far-fetched. and then it actually happened. Because I go to a lot of academic conferences where they've been talking about attention and transformers and various NLP mechanisms for quite a few years, and all of a sudden it just happens. So it's a tricky one. So for your work at the Institute, how do you guys distinguish between what you believe is plausible versus far-fetched existential risk, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no easy general answer to that, or everybody would always kind of be very wise about future pictures. That I think like there are a few general arguments, but then really what is going on, one has to look at the case by case basis. So general arguments are like different kinds of risk. Well, you could distinguish risks that arise from nature and anthropogenic risks that arise somehow out of human activity. And certainly if we look at existential risks, like threats to the very survival of the human species or like our entire future, one can see from these more general grounds that probably all the really big ones will be anthropogenic, just because we have survived risks from nature for hundreds of thousands of years, like firestorms and volcano eruptions and meteors and asteroids and all of these things. So if they have failed to kill us off in the last 200,000 years, they probably are not going to kill us off in the next 50 years, like just from priors. Whereas we will ourselves be introducing entirely new forces and phenomena into the world over the next 50 years that we have no track record of surviving. So like advanced bioengineering tools, like sophisticated AI systems, maybe molecular nanotechnology systems, new things that shape human dynamics, like communications platforms and like autonomous drones, like a host of things. Like if something is going to go seriously wrong within the next few decades, it's very likely going to come from something we did, maybe from something relatively new that we did. But then beyond that, you really have to, I think, dive in and evaluate each potential risk or technology on its merits. And the analysis will go differently depending on what the case is that you're considering. And obviously some degree of judgment will inevitably also come into the picture at the end of the day. These are often there's like a lot of data that can inform a decision, but ultimately it will also be a matter of judgment. If we're talking about unprecedented things that have never happened, you won't have like a big statistical data set where you can sort of rigorously show that the probability is 96.2% that something will happen, right?
Exactly. No, that's a fascinating point. Like, because you bring up bioengineering, for example, because I remember reading your book Superintelligence, and you had various pathways to superintelligence, which were fascinating, especially reading it back then. So, do you still see those pathways? I guess my question is, which pathways do you currently see most likely are still at risk, or have your views changed since the book's publication?
Well, we have more granularity now, obviously, on how the field of AI has developed and is developing than was available in the past. And every year we know more. So currently, obviously, these large transformer models seems like a very powerful general basis for building general intelligence on, right? It's like, seems like a very general learning algorithm, and then you can apply them to text, but you could also apply them basically as they are, with minor tweaks to sort of video input and sound input. And so that seems like the most likely path. Like maybe there will be some other things sort of built on top of that, like some episodic memory or something that enables long-term planning, or some other little thing that kind of sits on top of this engine block of large transformer models, or some slight variation that might be like transformer, plus, like some slightly different. But something in that ballpark looks like it's not yet run out of steam, and it's like chugging along quite nicely. And
yeah,
I mean, a few more generations of those, like GPT-5, GPT-6, like if those steps are as big as sort of the step from 2 to 3 and 3 to 4, that might well do the trick.
Yeah, that's a space we're keenly watching for sure. So, Nick, tell us a little bit more about your, because for my last question, I just want to wrap this up because this has been incredibly insightful. But as mentioned, you're the director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Tell us a little bit about your work there. Tell us about how people can follow you. Anything else you want to share as we finish this?
Well, so for me, so I'm not really being active on social media. The best way to follow me would be to go to my homepage, nickbostrom.com. And there's that's where I put new papers and stuff. I have been working on a book, which I'm not yet ready to announce, but I'm hoping it will come out maybe in March or so. So that would be something maybe to stay tuned for.
No, that's fantastic. I'm definitely putting myself on the pre-order list for that. And actually, everybody, we did share Nick's homepage down there. Yeah, because if you want to delve in some of the papers that Nick has published, absolutely fascinating. So Nick, this has been a incredibly insightful conversation. And again, really appreciate your time. I know your time is in massive demand. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for shedding light on this, I think, super intriguing topic of digital minds. And it's been an education. And again, can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Some good questions. I enjoyed our discussion.
No, super appreciate it. So until the next time, Nick, have a great weekend, everyone.
Right, you too. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye for now. Okay, everyone, that's a wrap, and we'll be seeing you next week on our next interview. Bye for now. Thanks again.